I'm Jeffrey Bear, and you're about to see a program that's become a Channel 11 favorite over the years. It's called Chicago by Boat. Now, we made this program in 1995 to showcase the remarkable architecture along the Chicago River. But what we didn't know back then was how rapidly development would continue along the river. Prosperous times and progressive city planning have sparked a whole new wave of development. So right now, sit back, enjoy the program, and then I'll be back at the end of the show to tell you what's changed along the Chicago River.
It has one of the most famous skylines in the world, bristling with giant towers. To architects, it's a modern Mecca, Chicago, the place where the skyscraper was born.
This is the Michigan Avenue Bridge. If you look around here, you can see a living museum of high-rise architecture styles. For example, that's a style called Beaux-Arts Neoclassicism from the turn of the century. And here's Gothic Revival architecture inspired by the great cathedrals of Europe. You can see the sleek high-rises of the 1920s, a style called Art Deco, and you can see the glass and steel boxes of the international style from the 60s and 70s. If you look way down there, you can even see some of the decorative postmodern buildings from the go-go 1980s. Why is all this here? Well, the reason is right down there, the Chicago River. The city is here because the river is here. They sort of grew up together. If you take a boat tour on the Chicago River, you get a real insight into the way the whole city developed. And you also get a great view of the architecture. So that's what we're going to do. We've arranged a private boat tour just for you, and I'm your tour guide. My name is Jeffrey Bear. I'm a producer at Channel 11, WTTW, but I'm also a volunteer for the Chicago Architecture Foundation.
For thousands of years, it was a meandering little weed-choked stream. The Native Americans respectfully named it after smelly wild onions, a name the settlers mispronounced Chicago. It may not have been much of a river, but it connected the Great Lakes to the heartland.
About 200 years ago, some folks came along who had what it took to turn that muddy creek into a river of gold. Their story begins right over here. This is called Pioneer Court. It's right at the foot of the Tribune Tower in the Equitable Building. In 1779, a trader named Jean-Baptiste Pointe du Sable built his log house right out there and became Chicago's first permanent resident.
He knew the native peoples around here didn't think much of European settlers. Since he was African American on his mother's side and his wife was Potawatomi, he figured maybe they'd prefer to do business with him. He was right.
It was people like Du Sable that made it here. People who knew how to look past the obstacles and think big. Chicago's famous city planner, Daniel Burnham, summed it up 100 years later with his famous rallying cry, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood."
By the time Du Sable left in 1800, a sprinkling of settlers had formed a village here. 2 years later, the U.S. government picked a site across the river for its westernmost outpost and built Fort Dearborn.
These markers show where the fort stood. Well, actually the fort was way down there near the level of the river, where the ground really is, where our boat is waiting for us.
We start out by sailing east of Michigan Avenue to the lake, where you'll see the lock at the mouth of the river. Then we turn around and head back west. We cruise right past the point where we started the tour and continue on until we come to Wolf Point. That's the place near the Merchandise Mart where the three branches of the river come together. From there, we head up the North Branch to an island in the river called Goose Island. We turn around and cruise back to Wolf Point and then go on down the South Branch past the Sears Tower to a place near Roosevelt Road where we get a great view of the skyline for our grand finale.
Hi, Roseanne. How you doing? You know, back in the days of Fort Dearborn, it was pretty muddy down here. Terra firma in Chicago was a little more like terra soggy. That's why the streets of the city are way up there today. We raised the whole city up out of the mud. It was a big job, but this is Chicago. No small plans. In fact, we moved the whole shoreline. The shore of Lake Michigan used to be way back there where you see the Michigan Avenue Bridge today. Fort Dearborn and Du Sable's cabin were on lakefront property. But there was a problem. there was a sandbar blocking the mouth of the river.
The soldiers got to work right away, opening up the mouth of the river and creating a better harbor. Eventually, the shoreline was extended way out there, about a half a mile into the lake. Now, all this newly created land and the alterations to the river allowed Chicago to become one of the world's busiest port cities. Within 50 years, this part of the river was bustling with industry. There were railroad yards and grain elevators, and the famous McCormick Reaper Works, which revolutionized farming. The river teemed with schooners and canal boats. In peak periods, boats would pass as frequently as today's airplanes at O'Hare, a rate of more than 2 per minute.
Today, as you can see, all that industry is long gone, and this area is being redeveloped under 2 very different master plans. Now over there, you have Illinois Center, which is sort of a 1960s concept in urban planning. On the outside, it's all about glass boxes and they're sort of barren, empty plazas. Inside, humanity is channeled into these sort of glassy pedestrian concourses, which I find a little bit confusing, but they keep you dry in the rain and warm in the winter, so they're convenient. Cars and trucks are relegated to these 3 subterranean layers of sooty roadways. Across the river is Cityfront Center, designed 20 years after Illinois Center. It's quite a different concept in urban planning. The plan calls for a mix of low and high-rise buildings of brick and stone and landscaped places to stroll and gather, like this river walk, which will someday extend all the way from Michigan Avenue to the lake. This fountain by Dirk Lohan is a typical feature of that master plan. The water cannon there, which is currently putting a big wall of water in our path, only runs for 10 minutes out of every hour. So since I think we want to stay dry, we'll wait for it to stop. Now, all of this land might be man-made, but not all of it was made by design. Some of the land on that side of the boat was created by an itinerant circus promoter, a boat captain, and would-be gun runner named George Wellington Streeter. Streeter ran his boat aground in 1886 on a sandbar near what is now the Hancock Center. He's the sort of guy that never really wanted to pass up an opportunity, so he decided to take up residence right there and opened an unofficial city dump around his boat. Within 2 years, he was sitting on a 180-acre parcel of newly created land. And since the land didn't exist on any maps, he claimed it for himself. Calling it the Free District of Lake Michigan, he and his wife, who everybody knew as Ma Streeter, defended it with a shotgun and a meat cleaver. Streeter sold lots cheap and even welcomed squatters. Unfortunately, his land was right on the doorstep of some of the most wealthy and influential citizens in Chicago. And they were furious, as you might understand, because Streeter's land was spoiling their lakefront view. They undertook legal battles. They even staged police raids. Several of these were actual armed conflicts, one of which involved over 500 deputies. But somehow, Streeter just managed to hang on until 1918. His downfall was selling liquor on Sundays. He was evicted from his land, and deputies raided the property and just burned everything to the ground. Streeterville is now the most expensive real estate in Chicago. Well, this is it, where the river meets the lake. That lock up ahead separates the two, which is a good thing because this river actually flows backwards. We reversed it in 1900 because sewage from the city was polluting our drinking water out in the lake, causing outbreaks of typhoid. How do you reverse a river? Well, it's a very, very big job. But remember, this is Chicago. No small plans.
At a point along the south branch of the river, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal was constructed. It was a bigger earth-moving project than the Panama Canal. On opening day, the river was diverted into the canal, making it lower than the lake and causing the backwards flow.
Now, if we had gone through that lock, we'd be out in the lake now. But that's another tour. So instead, we've turned around, and we're just going to sit here for a minute before we start our journey back to the west and take in a little bit of the scenery. For example, from this spot, you can see 3 of the 5 tallest buildings in America. Over there on the horizon is the Sears Tower from 1974 by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. That, of course, is the tallest building on the planet. Now, over there you can see the Hancock Building, which may be the second most famous building in Chicago, but it's not the second tallest, it's the 3rd tallest. The second tallest building in Chicago is right there, the Amico Tower by Edward Durrell Stone from 1974. That used to be the tallest marble-clad building in the world, but it's not anymore. You see, they had to completely reclad it in white granite because the thin marble veneer began buckling and was in danger of falling off. They've never actually disclosed the cost of that endeavor, but it's rumored to be more than the cost of building the building in the first place. One of the great things about Chicago is that most all of our land along the lake is permanently reserved for the public, thanks to Mr. Montgomery Ward, who fought a 20-year political battle to keep the lakefront, quote, forever open, clear, and free. One of the most popular lakefront gathering places is right over there on the horizon, Navy Pier, designed in 1916 by Charles Sumner Frost.
During its heyday, people came by the thousands, especially on hot summer nights, to catch a lake breeze, party in the beer garden, and take in the view. But more recently, it was 3,000 feet of rotting timber in search of a purpose. Well, not anymore. Thanks to a $245 million renovation, it's now a monumental urban playground and convention center. Under that Teflon-coated fiberglass roof is a 1,500-seat music theater. And there's a permanent Ferris wheel inspired by the first Ferris wheel, which was erected in Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. This one's smaller. It's only 15 stories tall. This little point of man-made land will someday be DuSable Park in honor of Chicago's first permanent resident. Standing over the park is the only private building east of Lakeshore Drive. I guess if a building is going to break the rules, it better be a significant monument. This one honors a Chicago architect who transformed the urban landscape throughout the world, Mies van der Rohe, the father of the glass and steel high-rise. Mies fled Nazi Germany and became head of architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology. He had proposed a building like this for Berlin in the 1920s. This one, called Lake Point Tower, was actually designed by 2 of his students, George Shipwright and John Heinrich, in the 1960s. It's over twice as tall as the one Mies envisioned. In fact, at 70 stories, they say it's the tallest apartment building in the world. Its curvy shape is quite different from the strict rectangular boxes that characterized his later style. As we head west, we leave this amazingly contemporary building that was actually envisioned in the 1920s and pass a building that looks very typical of the 1920s, but was actually built in 1989. This is it, NBC Tower, right in the heart of Cityfront Center, designed by Adrian Smith of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. It's an homage to the 1920s Art Moderne style, in which everything is done to emphasize soaring verticality. The windows are dark and recessed into the light-colored wall surfaces to create those uninterrupted stripes from bottom to top. About halfway up the building, you might have noticed the flying buttresses. They were inspired by similar flying buttresses on a much-loved neighbor building, the Gothic Revival-style Tribune Tower of 1925, which stands over the site of DuSable's cabin where we started our tour. The design by Raymond Hood and John Mead Howells of New York was the winning entry in the Tribune's famous 1922 international competition. The 2 architects were so proud of their building that they hid their signatures in the ornament around the grand entrance. Raymond Hood is represented by a figure of Robin Hood, and a howling dog stands for John Mead Howells. And if you can find them, you're doing better than us.
There were 264 entries, which were published by the Chicago Tribune in this book. Many of the entries were quite amazing. Take a look at this one, for example, from Walter Gropius, who founded the avant-garde Bauhaus in Germany, where Mies worked. Or this design by Eliel Saarinen, which inspired the building across the river from Tribune Tower, 333 North Michigan Avenue of Holabird and Root, completed in 1928, a superb example of the Art Moderne style. The double-deck Michigan Avenue Bridge, completed in 1920, was the engineering marvel of its day and set the stage for North Michigan Avenue to become our magnificent mile. Today, Chicago has more movable bridges than any city in the world. Chicago's modern bridges open quickly and easily because each leaf is essentially a giant counterweighted teeter-totter. A far cry from Chicago's first drawbridge, built in 1834 near what is now Dearborn Street. Early bridges were clumsy contraptions that were forever breaking down. According to one story, a swing bridge failed, dumping an entire herd of cattle into the river. Even when they worked, the old bridges were slow, and they had to be opened frequently because the river was so busy. Bottom line, getting across the river could be a hassle, so most people wanted their buildings over there, downtown. The area we now call the Loop became dangerously overbuilt. Many of the structures were flimsy and made of wood. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and it happened on October 8, 1871. It started down around 12th and Halsted and burned as far north as Fullerton. The Chicago fire wiped out 17,450 buildings and left a third of the population homeless. Miraculously, fewer than 500 people were killed. Many escaped, ironically enough, by running across those troublesome bridges. Before the ashes had cooled, Chicago vowed to rebuild. This was just about the same time metal frame construction was invented, which set the stage for an entirely new kind of building, the high-rise office tower. A new breed of architect came to Chicago to try it out. Louis Sullivan was the most famous. He designed the Auditorium building, Carson Pirie Scott, and many others. Sullivan scorned the idea of dressing up buildings in architectural styles from the past. Form follows function, he declared, and invented his own system of ornament. Sullivan and the other Chicago architects from this period created soaring designs that glorified the tallness and openness their new technologies made possible. Their style became known as the Chicago School of Architecture. Some of the early skyscrapers are still standing, but they're down in the Loop and you can't see them from the river. What we can see as we move west of Michigan Avenue Bridge is the evolution of styles that followed, starting with a style Sullivan hated. Look at Wacker Drive here along the river. This is a style called Beaux-Arts Neoclassicism, which exalts the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. Wacker Drive was just a small part of Daniel Burnham's grand Plan of Chicago, unveiled in 1909, which called for the entire city to be transformed into a neoclassical Paris on the prairie. Burnham had been the chief designer of the World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893. People from around the world came to see the city of skyscrapers that had risen from the ashes in just 20 years. But instead of showing off the avant-garde styles of the Chicago School, Burnham gave visitors a lavish neoclassical white city. Louis Sullivan said it set architecture back 50 years. Our most famous neoclassical building is certainly this one, the glorious Wrigley Building from 1921, designed by Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. It stands on a highly visible location, and its gleaming white glazed terracotta facade is brilliantly lit up at night. The design of the tower is based on the cathedral in Seville, Spain. In many people's minds, this is forever what a skyscraper should look like. Over across the river, the London Guarantee Building of 1923 by Alfred Alschiller is festooned with
Greek columns, a Roman triumphal arch, griffins, urns, balustrades. There's even a sort of classical temple up there on the roof, which was too much to resist for the members of the Tavern Club on the 25th floor of the building across the street. In 1957, the club devised an elaborate spectacle in which members' wives dressed up in diaphanous veils and gowns and performed a dance play in the temple while their husbands watched from their windows across the street. The whole thing was supposed to be synchronized to a narration played on loudspeakers. But unfortunately, the loudspeakers on the east side of the street failed, and they tell us all anybody was able to hear was the laughter of the hapless performers who were forced to improvise their movements and dialogue. Moving west about a block, we find a neoclassical building from 1926 designed by Thielbar and Fugard for jewelers who often carried valuable merchandise in their cars. The architects designed the building so tenants could put their cars on the elevators and park on their office floors. That way, they didn't have to unload their cars outside on the street. Not that the building was impervious to criminals. Al Capone ran a speakeasy up in the dome. In the 1950s, Mies van der Rohe proclaimed, "Less is more," and he stripped away all the superfluous ornament to glorify the steel frame itself. The IBM building across the river from the jeweler's building was his last and largest, completed in 1971, a year after his death. From this angle, all your preconceptions about sterile glass boxes just melt away. The purity and simplicity of this serene, dark slab set off on its pristine plaza create really a breathtaking statement. Mies was obsessed with finding the perfect proportions for every building he designed. Those thin vertical I-beams between the windows create a soft shading effect across the facade. Nothing here is taken for granted. As Mies put it, God is in the details. The buildings right across the street, like the architect who designed them, defy categorization. One thing is for sure, Marina City, designed in the 60s by Bertrand Goldberg, is the antithesis of Miesian modernism, even though Goldberg studied under Mies for a year at the Bauhaus. Mies surrounds his buildings with empty space. Goldberg packs 4 buildings onto one site. Mies works in angular steel, Goldberg in curvy concrete. Mies likes less, Goldberg loves more. In a sense, Goldberg was 20 years ahead of his time. In the happy-go-lucky 1980s, when it seems like there was a new building going up on every street corner, architects in the postmodern style started making bold, decorative statements. But unlike Goldberg, they often caricatured historic styles. Like this glassy Greek temple across the river and 1 block down from Marina City, the R.R. Donnelley building, designed by the famous Spanish architect Ricardo Bofill and Chicagoan James DeStefano. No matter what style they choose, architects who work in Chicago are very mindful of the fact that this is one town that takes its architecture seriously. For example, when the celebrated Chicago architecture firm of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill designed this Riverwalk in the 1980s, they were clearly respectful of Burnham's neoclassical plan of 1909. The Chicago connection is a little harder to spot in this meditation garden designed by the celebrated Japanese architect Kenzo Tange for the owners of the Hotel Nikko across the river. Let's see. Well, it's made of steel anyway. Everyone's heard of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, but did you know a much deadlier disaster happened right over there in the Chicago River between Clark Street and LaSalle? It was July 24th, 1915. The excursion boat Eastland was tied up over there. 2,500 Western Electric employees and their families had just boarded for a company outing. Suddenly, without warning, the Eastland began rolling towards the dock. The passengers, of course, were terrified and ran to the other side of the ship. The Eastland righted and then began listing towards the river. And this time, there was no stopping her. She rolled all the way over on her side. Some of the passengers managed to scramble out on the slippery metal hull and clung to it desperately. Policemen and volunteers jumped from the dock and formed a human chain to help them out. Others ended up in the river. Passers-by threw them life belts, ropes, anything that would float. But many of the top-deck passengers never got out, and many more drowned below decks. In all, 825 people were killed, including 22 whole families. As we pass under the Wells Street Bridge, we get a look at one of the biggest ideas Chicago ever had. When it opened in 1929, the Merchandise Mart was by far the biggest building the world had ever seen. It was designed by Graham Anderson Probst and White for Marshall Field's wholesaling operation. Unfortunately, it was 1929, the start of the Great Depression. By 1945, Field sold the building to Joseph Kennedy for just under $13 million, less than half the original cost. It's still the crown jewel in the Kennedy family holdings. The Mart is above all a monument to business. Out in front are bronze busts of the great merchant princes of America. Among them, Marshall Field, Mr. Filene, Mr. Woolworth, Montgomery Ward, and 2 presidents of Sears. In Chicago, our highest honors are reserved not for noblemen or soldiers or even politicians. Our heroes are tycoons. After all, remember, it was fortune seekers who built this town in the first place. They like to hang out at a tavern over there at Wolf Point, where the 3 branches of the Chicago River come together. It's just a few steps from where the Merchandise Mart now stands. To put it politely, these guys were, well, unrefined. But we named some streets after them anyway. For example, Kinsey Street was named after John Kinsey, who you might find there on a typical night entertaining the crowd on his fiddle. Kinsey bought DuSable's cabin in 1804 from a broker who he later killed in what was ruled self-defense. Kinsey made his fortune selling whiskey and other foodstuffs to the soldiers at Fort Dearborn and to the local Native Americans. Or you might find Gurdon S. Hubbard there. Hubbard drove a few hundred hogs to town and became one of the city's first meat packers. He used to go around in buckskin and carry a tomahawk. Later on, he was elected to the state legislature. Next to these wild and woolly types, the gentlemanly William B. Ogden stood out as an exception, although he was no less successful. Ogden came to town in 1835 to care for some land his brother had bought. Finding it knee-deep in mud, he wrote back that they'd been swindled, but after selling off a third of the land and making back the entire purchase price, he changed his mind about Chicago and became the city's first mayor. What brought all these people to town? Well, as I said before, it was the river. People had known since the 1600s that the river was a key to a vast inland trade route connecting the East Coast with the Gulf of Mexico. The only problem was a little bit of land down on the South Branch that separated the Chicago River from the rivers that flow into the Mississippi. In 1830, the new state of Illinois proposed to dig a canal there, and the land boom was on. In just 7 years, from 1830 to 1837, when the city was incorporated, the population grew from 70 to over 4,000. In 1833, a small lot on Clark Street sold for $100. 2 years later, it sold for $3,000. A year after that, it sold again for $15,000. The canal finally opened in 1848, but by then, Chicago was so big that a railroad came to town. Our friend Ogden had a stake in it. It was the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, and the station was right over there near the mouth of the North Branch. Now, the North Branch is a place where industry still survives. As we go up there, we might pass a gravel barge. There's an iron foundry, a chocolate factory, all kinds of industry. There's also plenty of Tony lofts, trendy restaurants, and one very upscale health club. It's a delicate and sometimes tense balance as industry struggles along the North Branch for its very survival. For example, behind me, you can see a cold storage warehouse that's been transformed into upscale urban housing thanks to Harry Weiss. If you look at the balconies, you can see how thick the insulated walls used to be. Harry Weiss has designed more residences for urban pioneers. Weiss calls these 4 futuristic, multi-leveled row houses the River Cottages. Because of the sloping profile, each balcony gives the residents a different perspective on the river and the city.
A few years ago, the folks in the River Cottages had a front row seat for one of the biggest disasters in the city's history. Already I've told you about two great disasters, the Eastland disaster and the Chicago fire. On April 13, 1992, a third great disaster occurred. An abandoned freight tunnel under the riverbed at right about this spot caved in. That freight tunnel was connected to another one of those Chicago-sized public works projects.
Mr. Mayor, good morning. Can you give us an update?
It was a turn-of-the-century network of small-scale railroad tunnels 40 feet below every street downtown. They'd been used until the 1950s to deliver coal and merchandise and remove trash, greatly reducing downtown traffic congestion, but since then they'd fallen into disuse. A torrent of river water surged into those tunnels, flooding every basement downtown. It took 7 days to plug the leak and another month to drain the buildings. No lives were lost, but when it was all over, damage was estimated at $950 million.
The Kinzie Street Bridge is too low for most river traffic, so it's staffed 24 hours a day. All the other bridges downtown are operated by roving crews, but maritime law still gives the river traffic the right of way, except during rush hour. That's why you sit in your car while a bridge is raised for one tiny sailboat or a handful of sightseers. The East Bank Club pioneered upscale migration into this area. It was built back in the 1970s when the river was still thought of as a dirty, smelly shipping channel. Best to wall yourself off from it. Nowadays, investors have a different opinion of the river. Developers of this chic loft project make a selling point out of their direct access to the water. Prices start at $220,000. A little farther up the North Branch, we come to a warehouse that's still a warehouse, part of Montgomery Ward's corporate headquarters. The river made a great thoroughfare for Ward's mail-order merchandise. Back in 1908, even a warehouse could be a work of art. Richard Schmidt, the architect, paid homage to the flowing river with the horizontal elements that run the whole length of the building. The building was so long that workers inside are said to have worn roller skates. The geometric ornament on the outside seems inspired by another great Chicago architect of the day, Frank Lloyd Wright. Such fancy decoration on a warehouse might surprise you, but then this was built for Montgomery Ward, who took great pride in the city. He topped off his Michigan Avenue office building with a statue of Diana, the Roman goddess. Unfortunately, that statue is gone, but you can see one that still survives atop Ward's old office building here on the North Branch. She's called the Spirit of Progress. In Chicago, even the gods celebrate business. This island in the river is as far north as we'll go. It's actually a man-made island, and the man who made it was none other than our old friend William B. Ogden, the city's first mayor. He was digging clay for brick here. He named the island after himself, William B. Ogden Island, but everyone called it Goose Island. Apparently, the Irish who settled here kept flocks of geese. Today there are plenty of geese and ducks in the river, which brings us to the subject of wildlife. And I'm not talking about those nightclubs in River North. The fact is, 200 years of progress have been murder on the river. But the river is actually getting cleaner, thanks to things like the Deep Tunnel Flood Control Project and improvements in sewage treatment. The late Mayor Richard J. Daley prophesied that one day downtown office workers would catch their lunches in the river. People laughed back then, but today, 34 species of fish live in the river. There are even freshwater sponges down there. In fact, there are 8 times as many fish up there in the North Branch as there used to be, even though the North Branch is still very polluted. The EPA says it's only approved for secondary contact. That means you could get some in your mouth, but they sure don't recommend it. But the main branch of the Chicago River, where we started our tour, has actually been approved for general use. That means, in theory, you could swim in it. As we return to Wolf Point, we pass evidence of more wildlife.
beavers have been gnawing on the trees here, according to our friends at Friends of the River. There aren't too many trees to gnaw on where we're headed next, the Skyscraper Canyon of the South Branch.
This building, 333 West Wacker Drive, was voted Chicago's most favorite in a recent Tribune poll. Perhaps Chicagoans aren't so territorial after all. Or maybe the public just didn't know that this building was designed by a New York architecture firm, Cohn, Peterson & Fox. It's built on a prime river edge location and splendidly celebrates its site. Its curving facade bends with the river, and its green color matches the river. The South Branch presented a new challenge to architects. Land here was so valuable that developers wanted their property crammed with as much rentable space as possible. Even the Opera House was designed with an office building on the top of it. Here again, the throne shape was used to fashion as tall a building as possible. People called it Insull's Throne, after the developer, utilities magnate Samuel Insull. His arrogance and ruthless business practices made him rather unpopular in this town. Some say that's why his throne turns its back on the city. The building was designed by Graham Anderson Probst and White and completed in 1929, just in time for the Depression that ruined Insull and many of his investors. He died penniless in 1938. On the west bank of the river, the obstacle to development was a dense network of passenger rail lines. But remember, that's prime real estate over there, and where there's a will, there's a way. Developers bought up the air rights and built right over the tracks. Most of these buildings are supported on columns placed between the tracks. But there were so many tracks under the southwest corner of the Morton International building that there was nowhere to put a column. So that corner is literally hanging out in space, suspended from trusses on the top of the building. Rather than cover up the trusses with a roof, architect Ralph Johnson of Perkins & Will left them exposed to celebrate the steel construction so important to the Chicago skyscraper and to refer to the steelwork of our bridges. Next door is the very first building built over the railroad, the old Daily News building by Holabird and Root from 1929. In the original design, each arm of this throne-shaped building had a giant sphinx on the top of it. Those plans were dropped, but this building does feature some of the most beautiful low-relief Art Deco ornament in the city. Chicago's historic Northwestern train station, which once stood just west of the Daily News building, was another victim of high property values here. This office tower, which still has a train station at the base, replaced it in 1987. It was designed by Helmut Jahn, the prolific and internationally famous Chicago architect who makes flamboyant statements out of colored reflective glass and tubular steel. Jahn first proposed this design for the annex to the Board of Trade, but the client thought it looked too much like a cash register. On the North Branch, we saw Montgomery Ward's. Here on the South Branch stands the other mail-order giant, Sears. We'll talk about Sears' famous tower in just a minute when we have a better view. Sears, Ward's, and other catalog companies made Chicago the mail-order capital of the world. So in 1931, we built the world's largest post office, designed by Graham Anderson Probst and White. Today, because of new technologies in mail sorting, this post office is obsolete. A state-of-the-art, high-tech facility across the street replaces it. Look at how Congress Street runs right through the old post office. The highway wasn't there when the post office was built, but the architects knew the Burnham Plan of 1909 called for it to be built someday. Just west of the post office, the Burnham Plan called for a vast plaza and domed civic center as a focal point of the city. Today, the Circle Interchange is located there, and in a funny way,
Burnham's vision has come true. It is a focal point of the city, just not exactly the one Burnham imagined in the days before automobiles. Just south of Congress, development suddenly stops. Several plans were proposed for this former industrial land, but with the overbuilding of the 80s, those are on hold now. One lone project was partially completed here before things ground to a halt. It's River City, another whimsical work by Bertrand Goldberg. Like his Marina City downtown, it embraces the river with docking facilities for the boaters and splendid views for the people who live here. As we turn around to head back home, take a look at this magnificent skyline. This is maybe our finest view yet of the way architects celebrate the sky. There's Halliburton Root's Chicago Board of Trade, a splendid Art Moderne building from 1930, topped off with a statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of grain. Helmut Jahn did the glassy addition in 1980, duplicating the setbacks of the original tower, and he capped off the addition with a similar pyramid-shaped roof and crowned it with a sculpture of its own. The top of 190 South LaSalle, a building from 1987, resembles the roof of one of Chicago's early skyscrapers, John Welborn Root's Masonic Temple, which was demolished in 1939. This is the only Chicago building by America's premier postmodernist, Philip Johnson, with John Berge. Architect Adrian Smith of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill topped off the AT&T Corporate Center with ornamental masts. The building was completed in 1988. It seems almost everybody has an opinion about the cylindrical top of this building, 311 South Wacker, designed by Cohen, Peterson & Fox of New York. The blazing white barrels are lit with 2,000 fluorescent tubes. They dominate the night sky. It seems like almost a desperate end of the 80s attempt to attract tenants to this enormous speculative building, which was touted as the largest reinforced concrete building in the world. But it's the Sears Tower, more than any other building, that stands as the supreme monument to big thinking in Chicago. Designed by Bruce Graham of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill and completed in 1974, it represents high-rise architecture stripped to its barest essentials, glass and steel, and pushed as far into the sky as anyone ever dared to go. Sure, the statistics are mind-boggling. 110 stories, over 4 million square feet, a daily population of 25,000. The building even has its own zip code. Imagine the foundation, the plumbing, the elevators. Think about the wind forces the building has to resist. But what really matters to Chicago is that it's king of the hill, the tallest building in the world, at least for the moment. Like a retiring champion, the Sears Tower will soon have to relinquish its title. A taller building is under construction right now, and it's not in Chicago. It's not in New York either, or Houston, or any other U.S. city. It's in Malaysia. While skyscraper architecture has slowed to a trickle all over the United States, it's a booming business in the developing countries of the Far East. Will skyscrapers rise again in Chicago? It's a good bet. We've gone through booms and busts before. There were no office buildings built at all in downtown Chicago from 1931 to 1954. But in just 10 years, from 1980 to 1990, over 50 were constructed. When will the next wave come? No one really knows, but when it does, two things are almost certain. It will follow the river, and it will be ambitious. After all, this is still Chicago, where we do the impossible, and where Daniel Burnham's famous words still echo, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." Since 1995, when this program was made, a new wave of development has taken place, and as predicted, it has followed the river. But the new building boom is very different from the one that took place in the 1980s. Back then, architects were building high-rise office towers. And of course, there's always still talk of building a new world's tallest skyscraper in Chicago. But the craze these days is for lofts, condominiums, and townhomes, as well as so-called mixed-use developments. The river's edge is becoming the hottest place to live as well as to work. The city is doing its part with expanded walkways and new landscaping, trendy river edge cafes, and quiet parks. At night, 11 downtown bridges are awash in $1.8 million worth of computerized lighting. Just as important are new city rules that require private developers to include things like walkways, boat docks, and fishing piers in their river edge projects. Here are a few of the latest developments. On the river's main branch, the former Cityfront Center has been sold. The new developer is building the largest mixed-use project of all, River East, on 13 acres at a cost of $1.5 billion. The 10-year plan calls for 2,000 residences and parking for 4,000 cars. There'll be 7 luxury condominium high-rises, townhomes, a hotel, and a 21-screen movie theater. Further west, the former traffic court building, which was built as the Reed Murdoch Grocery Warehouse in 1914, is being converted to housing, stores, restaurants, and offices. And it's getting its old name back. At Wolf Point, where the 3 branches of the river come together, are the River Bend Residences, consisting of a condominium tower and 4 townhomes priced up to $2.5 million, but that includes the 50-foot boat slip. The project was 40% sold before the developer even broke ground. And the Kennedy family, which sold the Merchandise Mart in 1998 for $575 million, is hoping to build a, you guessed it, mixed-use development on land they still own here. And take a look at what's new on the North Branch. Here's Kinsey Park, a 6.5-acre gated community consisting of 344 residences. This is another development that was selling like hotcakes while it was still under construction. The going rate for riverfront townhomes here is $1.1 million. Condos range from $300,000 to $800,000. Further up the North Branch, Montgomery Ward has sold 23 of its 28 acres. Ward's will retain its modern high-rise as a corporate headquarters, but the new owners of the rest of the property plan to convert the older buildings and add new construction to create a city within a city of apartments, stores, restaurants, and offices. Even on the South Branch, where office towers rule the sky, new places to live are popping up. The old Butler Brothers warehouse has been converted into a residential loft building. And there's even talk of turning the old Maine post office into a mixed-use facility, including residences. Maybe the most exciting thing about the new interest in living along the river is that it's brought back to life the very first mixed-use development ever built here, Bertrand Goldberg's Marina City. For years it languished in financial trouble and disrepair, but today the condo units are selling for record prices. The residential towers have been given a facelift, and the House of Blues has taken over the old theater building. The office building has been converted into a blues-themed hotel, and the restaurant has a new owner and a new look. Architect Goldberg died in 1997, but he did live long enough to see his vision realized for a thriving city within a city. Today it soars over a river alive with activity almost 24 hours a day, the prototype of an idea whose time has finally come.